Okay, in the second part of this lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about preferences and preference relations. So I'm just going to introduce the basics. We'll talk a lot more about this on Monday. But we've defined relations very abstractly, very generally, the general definition, and looked at some properties of it. But now we want to not just talk about relations generally, but talk more specifically about relations. And even more specific than that, relations that or preferences that this person, Totrep, relations that he is willing to express. So we have a set of items X, and we're interested in expressions of preference among these items. And the idea is that he's going to be making comparisons of the form, I strictly prefer X to Y. Now, preferring or choosing X is different than liking or having a taste for X. You may be faced with a set of options that you just uniformly dislike. You don't like any of the available options, yet you still will be forced or maybe in a position where you have to express a preference among objects in that set. There's a well-known movie, Sophie's Choice, that is about just this option. She has to make a horrible choice. She doesn't like any of the choices she has to make about her children, but yet she still is forced to say, I strictly prefer this one option over this second option. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that preferences here are always understood as comparative. Preference is more like bigger than big. So you're always comparing two objects. You never just say, I strictly prefer X. Rather, you'll say, I prefer X, some object X, over some other object Y. Now, suppose we have a set of outcomes or a set of options, and we have two of these objects. In general, there are four logically possible preferences that Totrep can express. So imagine you have Totrep, he's sitting here and he's looking at these two options, X and Y. And he thinks to himself, what preference do I want to express about these two objects, X and Y? Well, the first thing he can say is, I strictly prefer X over Y. So I strictly like X better than Y. A second thing is, well, I have the reverse preference. I strictly prefer Y over X, or strictly prefer Y to X. Third, he might say, well, I thought about it and I've considered both of those options, and both of those options look equally good to me. So I'm indifferent between X and Y. And finally, the fourth logical possible answer he could give is, I just simply cannot compare X and Y. I don't have enough information to compare X and Y. Now, I just want to highlight these last 2 points and make sure that you understand that the difference between these two responses. Being indifferent between X and Y is a positive claim. It's a claim about how you feel about X and Y. You thought about it, and it's just that your tastes are such that you like both X and Y equally. Answering 4, if you say, well, I just don't have enough information to compare to X and Y, this is a lack of a preference. You're not actually expressing the preference. So one of the assumptions we're going to make is that our agent Totrep always expresses a preference. He never will lack a preference between X and Y. So we're just, by assumption, going to rule out this fourth response. He will never be able to say, I don't have enough information to compare these two options. Actually, we'll get back to this throughout the semester, so just keep this sort of in the back of your mind. So now we can define what a preference relation is. A preference relation is just going to be a relation on X, so it's a subset of X cross X, that satisfies two properties. The first is asymmetry. So just to remind you what asymmetry is, asymmetry says if X is strictly preferred to Y, then Y is not strictly preferred to X. And negative transitivity, that says if X, we'll state it in its positive form. If X is strictly preferred to Y, then for all z, either x is strictly preferred to z or z is strictly preferred to y. So that's negative transitivity. So if we say that the towchup has a preference relation, or we assume that an agent has a preference relation, what we mean is that the agent preferences are represented by this relation, by some relation, that satisfies these two properties, asymmetry and negative transitivity. So what does that mean about the preferences that the agent has? So here's a simple lemma. If your strict ordering or your preference relation is actually a preference relation, so it satisfies the property of being asymmetric and negative transitive, then that relation satisfies three additional properties. First, it is irreflexive. So what irreflexive means, this is kind of the negation of reflexivity. Irreflexive means for all elements A is not related to itself. So reflexivity means everything's related to itself. Irreflexivity means it's not the case that nothing is related to itself. So to see why it's irreflexive, that follows directly from asymmetry. So asymmetry says that if x is strictly preferred to y, then y is not strictly preferred to x. To get the irreflexivity property, just let y equal x. So if y is equal to x, so we also have is x is strictly preferred to x, then x is not strictly preferred to x. And this last equation is just equivalent to, or this statement here is equivalent to, x is not strictly preferred to x. Okay, the next property that a preference relation has is transitivity. So to see why the preference relation is transitive, suppose that x is strictly preferred to y and y is strictly preferred to z. We want to prove, so the question is it the case that x is strictly preferred to z? Okay, so we don't know, but we would like to know whether or not it's the case that x is strictly preferred to z. Well, since x is strictly preferred to y, by negative transitivity, we know for all z, but in particular this z right here, either x is strictly preferred to z or z is strictly preferred to y. But we've also assumed that y is strictly preferred to z. And by anti-symmetry, that means it cannot be the case that z is strictly preferred to y. So all we're left with, the only possibility, is that x is strictly preferred to z. Okay, so we've proved that our preference relations are irreflexive and transitive. To see that the relations are acyclic, that's straightforward given transitivity and irreflexivity. So suppose we have these sequence of objects, x1, x2, x3, x4, and so on down to xn. So if x1 is strictly preferred to x2 and x2 is strictly preferred to x3, by transitivity, this means that x1 is strictly preferred to x3. Now, by asymmetry, since x1 is strictly preferred to x3, this means that it cannot be the case that x3 is strictly preferred to x1. We can continue this reasoning for a sequence of any length, because if we also know that x3 is strictly preferred to x4, so we have x1 is strictly preferred to x3, which is strictly preferred to x4, so we can get this strict preference between x1 and x4, and we know again there's no relation going back, and so on. Okay, so if we have a preference relation, then we know that that relation is irreflexive, transitive, and acyclic. Now, just to conclude, there are two other relations that we can define from our preference relation. So if we have a strict preference relation, then we can define from that two other relations, namely a weak preference relation and our indifference relation. So weak preference says I weakly prefer X to Y. So intuitively that means either it's the case that I strictly prefer X over Y, or I'm indifferent between X and Y. I haven't told you which. Now, since we assumed asymmetry, that this weak preference, that idea is represented by simply saying Y is not strictly preferred to X. So you weakly prefer X over Y if you know it's the case that you do not strictly prefer Y over X. So if you don't strictly prefer Y over X, that means there's one of two possibilities. Either you're indifferent between X and Y, or you strictly prefer X over Y. Okay, so X is weakly preferred to Y if it's the case that either X is strictly preferred to X over Y, or you're indifferent between X and Y. Now, being indifferent, we can define our indifference relation. So indifference just means it's not the case that I strictly prefer X over Y, and it's not the case that I strictly prefer Y over X. So remember our list of four logical possibilities. We had strict preference in one direction, strict preference in the other direction, and then the last two was either I say I'm indifferent, or we say that I don't have enough information to compare X and Y. And I said we rule out that last option. So the agent always has to express some type of preference. And if we know that he's not expressing the preference that X is strictly preferred to Y and not expressing the preference that Y is strictly preferred to X, the only thing left is to say that the agent is indifferent between X and Y. So this is just a short, quick introduction to preference relations. We'll talk a lot more about these on Monday. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, talk to me in class, or stop by my office. Okay.